So, good afternoon. My name is Andrea Chavez. I am the co-coordinator of the governance and infrastructure in the Amazon project named GIA. We will be several presenters today. We have GIA student Ali Sabo from Geography, GIA student Carla Mere from School of Natural Resources and Conservation, and as well GIA student Gabriel Carrero from as well Geography Department, and Bosch Bushbaha as well, the GIA coordinator. But this presentation would not have been possible without the help of so many other people, especially like our 12 GIA students, members, 2 postdocs, 9 participating faculty members, and 3 local regional coordinators, and the many more GIA friends and workshop participants. So GIA gave a Tropilunch past December, and we were then presenting the projects, our first activities of the first year of 2019. But since then, we really have been working and producing reports, analysis, preliminary assessments, which we want to share with our partners now, and of course, we want to give you updates on that as well. So here's our table of content. Next. We're going to give a little bit overview of the project and give you a little bit of insights into our 4 regional communities of practice, like the organized workshops there. Our finding and analysis would be based basically on the results of the timelines, participatory mapping, and the preliminary assessment of the effectiveness and conservation strategies. And then we will touch a little bit on what are our next steps as well with our project, with our partners. And so let's go a little bit back as well. What is GIA next? So GIA is an initiative which is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation since 2019, and in order to form a community of practice for learning and reflection on the use of strategies and tools. And this for them to have a more efficient governance and infrastructure, environmental governance, and reduce the threats of coming basically from infrastructure development, from dams and roads. So what we want to understand basically is how this business as usual, kind of like the stakeholder roles, how they function, and especially because we know that there is this unequal power relation stemming as well from the national political leaders, the financial sectors, the companies. They all influence infrastructure governmental systems. And we want to know as well how the social and environmental factors play a role here in having influential characteristics. And so our framework in this regard, next please, is based then on, you can see it here, on 10 classes of conservation actions that are described in 3 classes of territorial management and protection, political mobilization and negotiation, and enabling conditions. This is defined by the Conservation and Measures Partnership CMP version 2.2. You will hear a little bit more about kind of like a little bit of more the ins and outs of these again later on in the presentation, but I wanted to give you kind of like the insights of how our now our framework is kind of like based on this 10 broader CMPs that you see here. And one of our guiding study has been on specifically on the tools and strategies that have helped explain the conservation effectiveness, including kind of organizational strategies and as well exogenous factors. Next, please. So during our first year, we worked in four 4 focal mosaics. This was in the Amazonia Colombiana in Colombia, in Loreto, Peru, in Alto Madeira, in Bolivia, in Brazil, and in Brazil, in Sul do Amazonas and Norte de Rondônia. And here we organized as well 4 different workshops, and we collected data with our partners. Next, please. And our methodology that we used basically was our methodology that we use, and specifically on one of our major products that we did this year was a preliminary assessment on, which I already mentioned, the preliminary assessment on tools and strategies. And here we collected data from the 4 different regions via interviews, via workshop or websites, and as well data collected from 55 cases by GIA partner organizations, and held as well like through the workshops and via information from the governments and NGOs as well. So today what we want to do is we wanted to report on those results from our analysis that we did, and later on you will hear a little bit more about this preliminary assessment report. And we want to give you as well insights to our next steps and what we're going to be doing with the data and how we're sharing these data with our partners. Next. And now I would like to give the floor to Ali.
Thanks. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about one of the ways that we collected some of this data, about a tool that we used across all the MOSAICS at each of the workshops that we conducted last summer. So basically, we created timelines, and we used it as a tool to generate discussion and reflection among workshop participants, but also to collect knowledge and information about governance and infrastructure in a participatory way. So through this activity, basically, we were able to visualize some of these really complex regional histories and distill some of that complexity into key moments that have changed over time. So whether those be like policy changes or regime change or specific infrastructure projects and their impacts, we used the participatory nature of making these timelines at the workshops, and we used it to do it from the perspective of the people who were participating in the workshops themselves. So we collectively created these timelines. You can see in the pictures here some of that process actually happening on the left. And then we later digitized them, and then we interpreted them, and we analyzed them through an analysis that the GIA team here at UF actually conducted. So for part of this presentation, basically, I'll just walk you through the process of how we created the timelines, and then how we analyzed them and some of the takeaways that have emerged from our analysis so far. And so the information that you see presented here emerged from these 4 workshops that we conducted in each MOSAIC that were all carried out last summer. And then we bolstered some of that information with interviews that we carried out with those partner organizations that participated. And at the workshops, basically, we simply asked participants to identify key events that have taken place in the MOSAIC that are relevant to governance and infrastructure. And we didn't limit the time or the scale of the event. So some of them started, some of the timelines, they started, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of them started in the middle of the 20th century. Some of them started just 20 years ago. So each one was a little bit different. It had its own character. In the same way, some of them were really full of like local scale events and regional events, while other ones were really focused on international and national scale events. And so here you can see the discussions that took place in creating these, and then on the right side is the 2 examples. I think that's Loreto and Brazil, the actual timelines that came from this. Next. And so then what we did was we digitized all of that information that we gathered. So following the workshops, the GIA team here at UF digitized each one. That one in the bottom right corner is the Brazil one. And so we did them all in a similar way. And first we put all that information into data tables that had some deeper details about each of the events that were mentioned. And then we created these actual visual timelines. So the idea was to have comparable timelines across regions so that we could have an informed analysis looking across the Amazon and try to identify some patterns regarding infrastructure and governance. And to achieve that, for the digitizing each of these, we followed the same format, but the format was a little bit flexible where necessary, because though each mosaic covered some years before 2000, each of the digitized versions are only 2000 to 2020, which is where most of the relevant events were concentrated. And so each timeline is also scaled. You can see on the left side from local to international, but each timeline has a different, kind of a different focus. This one here, you can see there's a lot going on at the national level. And so then we also categorized the types of events that people mentioned. So we created a typology. We had policy events, infrastructure events, impacts from infrastructure, environmental setbacks, and collective action. And so basically the result, it was that each of these timelines had anywhere from 2 to 5 categories. So not all of these categories were represented in each one. You can see collective action isn't on here on the Brazil one, and it actually only appeared in the Alto Madeira mosaic. And so this actually told us something really important about the timelines that were produced, and that's that they were very representative of the people who are actually participating in the workshop themselves. So in the Alto Madeira workshop, we had a lot of participation from grassroots organizers, which is likely why collective organizing came up as an important activity or important events that were mentioned. Some other ones didn't have so much grassroots organizations participating, and so that element didn't really appear. So we tried to include those types of understandings looking across the mosaics into our analysis. And the results that we have so far are these, the data tables that we produced, the 4 different timelines, like the ones that you see here that are in this digitized version. And then we also have a report. And then we also are working on a more easily digestible infographic version of that report. Next. Carla. Thank you. And so we selected some of the highlights that emerged from each mosaic that I'll present here. So basically in Loreto, we found that in the early 2000s, diverse stakeholders were able to come together and work together for regional government, with the regional government to advance environmental governance. And so notably, this included the establishment of regional protected areas and free, prior, informed consent for indigenous communities. So this is one of the more positive examples that we have emerging from the timeline, but then there are also challenges. So in Loreto, elections were key to kind of changing some of those relationships. And so the changing administration dynamics at the regional level made it more difficult sometimes for collaboration among stakeholders, especially after 2016. Then in Colombia, we see that the peace agreement in 2012 emerged as a really key event. So that agreement basically was forged between the Colombian government and the FARC, and it resulted in this kind of reconfiguration of actors and interests in the Colombian Amazon. And so the government aims were to increase their presence in the region through infrastructure development and state programs. But then you also see a lot of land speculation happening and emerging on the timeline. And so kind of these new actors coming out and the expansion of the agricultural frontier. So these increasing socio-environmental threats bring together these different organizations and these different actors, and they're now trying to work together on policy frameworks related to territorial planning and local participation. And so that's what you really see emerging on the Colombia timeline. In the Brazil mosaic, which we call the Northern Rondônia, Southern Amazonas mosaic, you really see the centrality and the importance of federal policies coming out in terms of influencing infrastructure development, and in Bolivia as well. So in both of those, we can see very clearly that at the national and regional levels, those are drivers of change. And also IRSA, for example, comes up internationally as a pulse driving infrastructure across the regions. And so national level policies regarding land use and energy development are very critical here. And then the Alto Madeira you see in Bolivia, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that, sorry, my phone's green. But in Bolivia, there's a very clear concern by the workshop participants for the lack of binational governance concerning the 4 dams, which were the big focus of that workshop, that straddle the border. So despite the fact that there are many binational agreements concerning energy development, there's not that concern at the local level where this is actually taking place. And so we also see is some cross-border grassroots organizing that has emerged to try to fill in that gap a little bit. Next. And so finally, just some of the cross-cutting takeaways that we see looking across all 4 mosaics are that national governments are really central in determining the local environmental governance because they influence public policy in many sectors, but also their support for infrastructure governance is pretty consistent across even different administrations, where on the other hand, their support for environmental conservation is not so consistent. So we see a lot of change there, whereas support for infrastructure stays pretty constant. We also have seen that it's possible to advance environmental governance from the bottom up, but that requires identification of shared interests among a group of very diverse stakeholders that are also well-disposed local regional governments and that are interested in data and policy proposals. Political will also comes out as very important. And then finally, we also see how interest in various natural resources evolves over time. So for example, in the case of Brazil and Bolivia, water for hydropower generation, and the desire to export different commodities, how that can really impede environmental governance in a very top-down manner. And finally, very key, we see that collaboration, both horizontally and vertically, among all of these various stakeholders that are involved is key. It's critical for fostering long-term conditions for good governance. So from these analyses, we have some critical emerging questions. For example, understanding these conditions for good governance. For example, how do you sustain, how do you facilitate collaboration in the face of these political challenges and changing administrations? And how does collaboration unfold in the face of infrastructural threats, things like this. And so we're looking forward to moving forward with those questions that have emerged from this analysis. So that's where we're at currently.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to be summarizing some of the results or preliminary results we have from the participatory mapping. So we conducted this participatory mapping in each of the mosaics as part of one of the activities of the workshop in each of the mosaics. And the idea of conducting this participatory mapping was to assess how geospatial data sets enable the comparison and understanding of areas of key value, concern, and recommended actions within the community of practice. Also, the process of doing this participatory mapping was an activity that was going to, we hope that it was going to promote multi-stakeholder dialogue and also as a way to strengthen this community of practice. So the methods that we use, so we have a different group of participants in each of the mosaics and from different institutions, including government, grassroots organization, NGOs, indigenous representatives. So we divided this group into smaller groups, and each group had one facilitator who did not participate in the PMAP exercise. So this PMAP exercise was divided in 2 main steps, which included mapping in small and also in large maps. In the smaller groups, each participant had to list from 1 to 3 areas of value, areas of concern in the region, and also indicate why they selected those areas of value and concern and list those descriptions on the flip chart. And they also provided recommended actions for the areas of concern. And again, these were listed on the flip chart. On the maps, the participant drew polygons, lines, or points to indicate these areas of value and areas of concerns. And at the end, as we can show in some of the pictures in your right, we have these large maps that were used to summarize the results of the entire group, and also as a way to promote dialogue and discussions among all the participants. So from the small maps, we categorize the names of the areas of value and concern listed by each participant in the following categories, which were indigenous territories, protected areas, infrastructure projects, exploitation projects, which includes all oil and mining, larger landscapes that included biological corridors, frontiers, or areas that didn't have specific political boundaries. We also have administrative boundaries that refer to city, towns, or provinces. and also river and watersheds. So here we can see these bar graphs that show us the counts of responses per category, and also the word clouds that will facilitate the visualization of these areas that were frequently listed or used by each participant. And we can see the areas of value listed by each mosaic, except for Bolivia, because in Bolivia it was the first workshop and the initial methodology varied from the other 3 mosaics. And in their case, they only describe areas of concern and recommended actions. So from these results, we can see that the areas of value are mostly represented by protected areas in the 3 mosaics, which include national parks, also regional conservation areas, mostly for Brazil and Peru. And for Colombia, they also have areas of value that are represented by important biological corridors that include the Chiribiquete National Park with other protected areas. Gabriel?
Yes. So regarding to the why these areas are of value, we categorize those. So the dimensions totally almost 200, but mostly the part for Brazil. So in the right-hand chart, we see the categories we created with keywords represent why they said it was of value. And from forest up to biodiversity, we categorize as environmental, and from human capacities to other, it's all like social aspects of value. And you can see that Brazil is up in many of the social values, whereas Colombia, they value it mostly for biodiversity. And in Peru, it's a kind of a distributed, but also they value a lot the forest and the social, the cultural and spiritual values. Next, please.
Okay. So for the areas of concern, we did the same thing. We categorized the different names that they listed for the areas of concern, following the same previous categories that I mentioned before. And as we can see, most of the areas of concern are related to infrastructure projects, particularly for Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru. For example, in Peru, we have highways are an important area of concern. For Brazil, we also have dams and highways. And for Bolivia, we have dams and highways. There is some overlap in the areas of concern between Brazil and Bolivia. Mostly related to the dams projects in both regions. And also for Bolivia, we see that these areas of concern were also listed as particular towns or provinces in the region, and also rivers and watersheds. I think which all of them relates to infrastructure, specifically the dams projects in Alto Madeira.
Yeah, regarding why these areas are of concern, here in the left side, we can see the 4 MOSAICs, and in this case, Bolivia had most of the mentions or majority of it. And then in terms of categories, we have production, infrastructure, extraction, which is oil and gas, and many social environmental impacts, but also only socioeconomic issues related. And again, Brazil had most concerns in terms of socioeconomic issues, whereas Bolivia, mostly because of the hydroelectric, had high infrastructure citations, and also social environmental impacts related to this infrastructure, mostly dams. but also production in terms of like agriculture expansion and aquaculture was very highly cited in Bolivia too. And here we have a breakdown on those big categories, just to show in the up left, the production in terms of the three categories. We added logging here. So we see logging and agriculture as a main driver here, concern. And then in infrastructure extraction, it's dams and mining, the most areas that were cited. In terms of social environmental, not extraction, but issues or impacts, we have most of them in Bolivia, but yeah, we see that water like flooding and sedimentation were very cited, but also the biodiversity loss. And at the end, socioeconomic issues, we have Brazil with a high concern regarding land invasion and insecurity and land conflicts, and other socioeconomic and cultural impacts also in Bolivia and Brazil. And whereas Colombia also had high land invasion and conflicts, but also issues related, Colombia and Peru, to narco trafficking and armed groups and armed trades. Okay.
Okay, in this map, we are showing the data from the large maps. We digitized the polygons that each participant drew on the large maps. And it's just a map to show how all these different areas of concern are overlapping with important protected areas and indigenous territories in each of the 4 mosaics. We are currently digitizing, or we have already digitized all the polygons from the smaller maps, and we are in the process of creating these maps that link with the attribute of each of the areas that participant listed. So participant also provided recommendations for each of the areas of concern, and as we can see, the recommendations range from conducting more research before implementing infrastructure projects, making the results of the research more accessible to local communities and the society in general, and also make these results easy to understand for the general public. We also have recommendations that included fiscalization, more supervision and regulation, involvement of the government sector. So we have more than 100 recommendations from the 4 different mosaics, and we decided to categorize these recommendations using the categories provided by the Classification of Conservation Actions by IUCN. And as we can see in this graph, for Bolivia, awareness raising, research and monitoring, institutional development, education and training are important recommended actions. For Brazil, we also have awareness raising, law enforcement, livelihood and moral incentives, and also conservation and designation planning. For Colombia and Peru, we have livelihood, moral incentives as an important recommended actions, but also we have legal and policy frameworks for Peru, and also research and monitoring. So just important preliminary takeaways from the participatory mapping is that we could demonstrate that it's an important tool that promote multi-stakeholder dialogue. We could learn more about partners' work and also their needs, concern, the areas that they think that they should be conserved the most or value the most, and also recommended actions. And also it opened a platform to demonstrate or show how could they work in synergy with each other. And as previously discussed, we showed that were some similarities across mosaics, that most of the areas of value are protected areas. These areas of concern were mostly infrastructure projects. These infrastructure projects vary among mosaics, being, for example, dams more important for Bolivia, and highways, for example, in Peru, and so on. So as I mentioned, we're in the process of summarizing the results of the PMAP and socializing with the partners in each mosaic.
Well, thanks everybody for being here, and this really highlights what a dynamic team of students we have, and a lot of the work that we've accomplished over the last few months, really, of getting all this data organized. I wanted to now talk about an analysis that we did on the conservation strategies that the organizations are using to achieve infrastructure, better governance, and what we can learn from this about what kinds of conservation actions are have the most potential to have a big impact. Going back to that first figure that Andrea showed about the inequality of power and how it's difficult to have representation of social environmental constituencies or interests, this is a schema of the different kinds of actions that conservation organizations can take. And this is what we have analyzed, which I'm going to present now real briefly. So going back to these 10 circles here are the classification made by the conservation measures partnerships of different kinds of conservation action, which we classified as things that lead into territorial protection and management, things that lead to political mobilization and negotiation, and enabling conditions that support these other two. So, and there are two analytical moves that we made that I want to share with this group. One is that we basically considered the strategy that each of these 55 organizations carry out as a set of conservation actions. And then, if maybe we can go to the next slide. We analyzed the strategy of those organizations, and then based on that, we made inferences about the conservation actions that were components of those strategies and how they ranked in terms of relevance and effectiveness. So our method was to look at each of those 55 cases. Those are the organizations that participated in the regional workshops that we did interviews with and studied their websites, and also got information at these workshops. And we understood what conservation actions they're carrying out according to that classification. And then we evaluated what we considered to be the relevance of those strategies to addressing infrastructure and the effectiveness of those strategies, either to slow infrastructure development or to mitigate the impacts of it. And we had a rubric that two of our senior staff members who were at most of the workshops, most familiar with those cases, those conservation strategies, we rated them on a scale of 0 to 3. And the other analytical tool that we used, or move that we made analytically, was that not only did we analyze those conservation actions across all of those strategies, but we focused in on which conservation actions were present in the most effective conservation strategies. So then so this second part of this graph here is showing that we zeroed in on the highly effective strategy, and they're thinking about what are the most commonly used actions and what type of organizations use those strategies. So I go to the next slide, our general results, and we have a report on this that is available that you can all access. It's in 3 languages, where we present actual data in a lot more detail. But just to give a quick summary, there are an average of 4 to 5 of those conservation actions from those 10 different categories per organization or per strategy. The most common ones were CMP, that's the Conservation Measures Partnership, number 9 and number 8, education and training and research and monitoring. And on the average, well, the relevance was fairly high. On a scale to 0 to 3, the strategies and their component actions were considered fairly relevant to infrastructure, whereas effectiveness was a bit lower. And that makes sense because of these power inequalities and how challenging it really is. to either slow or mitigate the impacts of infrastructure to really achieve good infrastructure governance. But when we looked at those highly effective cases, the 55, 8 kind of had a higher order of effectiveness. And of those 8, 4 of them were related to grassroots organizations, either community organizations or indigenous organizations. So 18% of the sample were grassroots organizations, and 50% of the most effective strategies were from those organizations. Okay. And then next slide, please. So of the 10 strategies, the ones that were most related to the more effective conservation strategies were, in the first place, law enforcement and prosecution. That's strategy 4, or conservation action 4, the first place. Second, awareness raising, which includes political action and communications. And third, legal and policy frameworks. And if you go back to our original classification, those 3 things were all in the broad approach of political mobilization and negotiation. And they came up as the most, the actions that were most present in the highly effective conservation strategies. Okay, next slide. And so these supporting conservation actions related to research and information generation, or related to organizational support at the level of individuals or organizations, were also important in those effective conservation strategies. Now, they were not disproportionately present, because if you remember, these were the most highly used conservation actions. So they were present in less effective conservation strategies and in more effective conservation strategies. But when we focus in on what you need to have an effective strategy, you should have a focus on political mobilization and negotiation, but supported by these other kinds of conservation actions, research and institutional support. And finally, one more, go ahead, next slide. Then within this overall framework, when you look at type of organization, the involving grassroots organizations was a key finding. There's one more thing that's actually not highlighted in the slide. Well, that this approach, law enforcement and prosecution, was considered the most likely to be associated with an effective strategy. It was also the least used conservation action. So there's a big differential between what we analyze as its potential to have an impact and its actual use. Okay, so those were our main findings. If we go to the next slide, they kind of leave us with some challenges or issues that we need to think about how to operationalize, how to implement. But if I just step back for a second and just say kind of where we are in terms of the project, we have just completed all of these analyses that you're seeing today. We did about 2 weeks ago a webinar presenting this report, and now we're about to have, and that was for the Pan-Amazon 4 regions together. We had over 100 participants in that community meeting. And now in the next couple of weeks, starting tomorrow, we're going to be having individual meetings with these different organizations. So these are questions that emerged from that first round of discussion that we can go into more depth at a next level of discussion, or we can also bring in the information about the timelines and the participatory mapping that were not presented at that first webinar. And then these help guide us in the actions that we will take in this second year, because from this analysis, we've identified what we saw as promising conservation actions based on that preliminary assessment. Has a transparent methodology, but it also has limitations in terms of how much we know or how it was based on our analysis. But we developed these challenges, and we definitely would like your input into these questions right now. How to build legal capacity in the grassroots organizations with the help of public defenders, lawyers, and universities. So that was identified as a high potential strategy, little used. How can you implement it? And then possibilities for strengthening alliances between academia, NGOs, and communities. So given that community organizations were considered highly effective, they don't operate alone. And so how can they be supported? So given them as a priority type of organization, but what's the synergy and alliances that we can support? And our community of practice really does set that up very nicely. And then thinking about the support strategies, the research and the organizational strategies that can effectively strengthen infrastructure governance that are focused on political mobilization and negotiation, but how to do that. Okay, so those are kind of the challenges that we see, and we have a plan of action over the next year to act on these findings. And so there's one final slide then, just to give you a brief overview of like what we're planning on next steps. So the immediate next step, of course, is continuing to return this information in each of the 4 regional groups. And then we have plans for continued experience, reflection, and learning on those priority conservation strategies based on the opportunities and the interests in those particular regions. And here we're focusing on 2 regions where we found more potential to add value. So the Upper Madeira, the Bolivia-Brazil border area, with a focus on binational watershed management. And the focus really there is empowering grassroots organizations through information and capacity building. So implementing that strategy of the grassroots organizations are the ones that are directly confronting infrastructure development, trying to pause or slow or mitigate, but how can they be supported with these other kinds of conservation actions? And in the Colombian Amazon, we'll be supporting grassroots organizations and regional governance to implement a initiative on green roads infrastructure. So again, we're kind of fitting into the ongoing agenda of those organizations that are working in the region, but looking for synergy between different organizations and creating this space for dialogue and also for learning. Okay, we're also going to do a series of case studies on the experiences that were considered effective from that preliminary assessment to really understand more about the enabling factors, the limiting factors, the organizational strategies, the limitations to their effectiveness, how this evolved over time, and so on. So we're going to do some studies on that. And then we're in the process of developing a working group on the promising but underutilized conservation action 4. And the conservation actions have sub-items, and the one that's really relevant here is non-criminal legal action. So the ones that were associated with our effective strategy weren't things like fines and criminal action, although those could be effective, but that's not what was used in our community practice, the non-criminal legal action. Finally, we're going to continue with webinars and our online platform at giaamazon.org, and we plan to have a final region-wide workshop in the spring semester of 2021. And we will continue to document learning and application throughout this process. So that's pretty much where we stand. Yes, we have many people to thank. As you saw, we have many presenters here, and they collected data with many GIA partner organizations. We also have in our call right now some of the regional coordinators. Ney from IEB is our partner in Brazil. Margie is from FCDS, our partner in Colombia. I don't know if Cecilia is on here, but she's a key local actor related to the Universidad Amazónica del Pando, the UF group, and the partners.